Wait, Alex, this doesn't sound normal.
Welcome everybody to Shock Docs. My name is Kenneth Jerke, and I'm joined on the mic by my bro host and bro producer, Mikhail Shocktin. How we feeling there, buddy?
Wait a minute. I don't know what name you just used. I'm Calvin Pollock. I'm a co-host of Reverb, but yeah, good to see you, Alex.
Hey, listen, folks, we decided that the whole reverb thing felt a little stale after 100 episodes, so we decided that for the next 100 episodes, we're going to be doing a rebrand to Shock Docs, the only podcast for silver-tongued pen devils who simply do not give a... Yeah, that's right, people. Our logos doesn't care about your pathos, and we're here today to talk some straight truth to you about rhetoric. That's right.
Alex, I don't know what you're doing. I don't, but I just want to tell the listeners I didn't approve this. I don't approve of this.
Now, speaking of our listeners, some of you out there probably sipping your soy lattes, highlighting your Foucault, might be thinking, rhetoric, isn't that just fancy talk for politicians who lie better than your ex? And to that I say, hell yes, but also hell no. Because rhetoric, my friends, is not just the art of bull. It's the art of making bull feel like truth. And sometimes the truth feels like bull. And if you can't tell the difference, congrats, my friend, because you've just been interpolated.
Are we going to get to the episode, or is this just... go ahead. I can't.
Now let's rewind a little bit, shall we? We're gonna go old school. No, not frat party old school, although we all know Isocrates definitely would have spiked that punch at Lambda Epsilon Omega. No, I'm talking about Plato, Aristotle, and that sexy bad boy Gorgias, who once said, "The speech is a powerful lord." You hear that, folks? That's right. Gorgias called speech a dom. Speech ties you up, whispers in your ear, and makes you beg for some sweet, sweet epistemology.
That's not appropriate, and we shouldn't say any of that on mic.
Now, Plato, much like my co-host here, is a good old prude hiding down in his cave, and he wasn't having it. He thought that rhetoric was mere flattery, and that it was the intellectual equivalent of a Tinder swipe with no intention to commit.
Oh, no.
But Aristotle, he had the right idea. This man loved him some rhetoric. His promiscuous inquiries into the topic led him to invent the first ever three-way. That's right. Ethos, pathos, and logos.
Alex, I think this is going to be my last episode. I'm done.
But don't get it twisted, folks. This isn't just about toga parties and syllogisms. Rhetoric's been everywhere, from presidential speeches to YouTubers hawking energy drinks that taste like grapefruit-scented battery acid. That's right, people. It's not just the art of persuasion. It's about all the ways that we make meaning through language. It's the reason your estranged uncle thinks the earth is flat and your boss uses words like synergy and think that they actually mean something.
Oh, no.
It's the soft power that makes the hard decisions. It's the tea you spill in every TED Talk. The not-so-subtle passive aggression that professors insert in every attendance policy. It's the Greek chorus in your group chat. So pour yourself a triple shot of logos, spike it with a little ethos, and chase it with some raw, uncut pathos. Because rhetoric is everywhere, baby. It's always watching, always listening, always persuading.
All right. That's, again, I just want to say this was entirely Alex's idea. If you want to blame someone for this, if you want to drag someone before the Hague, Alex Helberg is the person to go to for that. We won't do that ever again, and I'm so sorry. I apologize to our listeners. No, I mean, we had to do something special for episode 101, Alex, right? And something not at all upsetting, something very much within academic discourse norms.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I think we're doing great work here. And I actually, in all honesty, I do appreciate you putting that intro together for us.
Oh, likewise. And I thank you for suffering through it as you have 100 other episodes that you've had to sit on this microphone with me. So thank you for that, Calvin. Boy, I really have to get the shock doc out of my voice now. It's like it's hard once you get in, it's hard once you get into character. You have to find a way to slip out of it.
No, I do actually want to start like using Mikhail Shocktin as a pen name. I think that's
Yeah.
pretty sweet.
That's a great one. And I have to give props. Not only did Calvin come up with that one, he also came up with Kenneth Jerke. So, I mean, just to be clear, we were sort of co-conspirators on this, but I definitely will take all of the blame and all of the charges that the ICC levels against me for that monologue. So,
Look, speech is violence, and I think we all just experienced what that feels like.
living proof. Here it is, folks.
But no, we're really excited to get back on the mic here. It's been, I think, a very strange time in discourse and rhetoric, especially particularly political discourse with the second Trump presidency. Have we done any episodes about this administration's rhetoric yet?
No, we have not. I mean, other than certain parts of our episodes with Charles Athanasopoulos and Corinne
Yeah.
Mitsuye Sugino certainly touched on the current conjuncture that we find ourselves in. But I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's definitely been a very overwhelming time for, trying to focus on just any one issue, very similar to Trump 1. A lot of the kind of discourse, rhetoric, and policy has been coming kind of fast and furious in the first few months of this administration at a level that I mean, whether you were talking about immigration and deportation, free speech, all the way to things like tariffs, it's just been kind of a deluge. And it's been hard to know exactly where to even begin trying to make some sort of cohesive sense over what this moment means.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes back to something we discussed a lot last year, which is just the kind of rhetorical ineptitude of
Yeah.
this movement, this Trumpist movement, and the rather troubling questions that raises about just to what extent one's rhetoric has to be good or has to be effective or has to be rigorous and well supported. One of the things that we've seen a lot in this administration is a lot of AI generated executive orders and like website copy. There's even speculation that ChatGPT was used to generate the tariff policy,
Yeah.
which we're going to get into in a little bit, but just a kind of raw power without a need to legitimate itself through traditional norms of effective discourse or effective rhetoric.
Yeah, it's startling, I think, for a lot of people. And especially, I mean, I think we're not clearly the first people to point this out, but one of the things that has been most remarkable about this time is also seemingly the lack of a powerful counter rhetoric. Not even
Sure.
just, I mean, the Democratic Party certainly has kind of shown that they're overtly stated our strategy is to do nothing or just kind of give them the rope to hang themselves with. But that rope is used to hurt us too. And I mean, it's just, you don't see the same kind of movement building, I think, at least not yet. Who knows? The weather's getting warmer. People are going to start going outside, hopefully a little bit more and talking to each other and organizing. But yeah, I mean, I think there's just been this kind of perceived lack of counter energy to that raw exercise of power, such that they don't feel the need to justify their pretty on its face kind of lazy, awful, no patina of ethics, overtly cruel celebrations of just like some of the weirdest kinds of cruelty. Even just looking at, I mean, we could do a whole episode on the White House Twitter account.
Or JD Vance's Twitter
Yeah.
account. Like
Yes.
this kind of extremely petty rhetoric of grievance and like interpersonal kind of like dunking on people in replies. Like I saw JD Vance engaged in a back and forth with Zed Jelani, who's just sort of like an
I saw
obscure
that too.
former Intercept reporter. So it's just kind of like, what is going on here, and how has power become so kind of banal and like divorced from, again, the kind of norms of legitimacy that used to be taken for granted? It has to be expressing some kind of like broader break from those norms, and that's been discussed before, but like I think that contributes to some extent to these cycles of cynicism where people see just how banal and inept the rhetoric of the powerful is, and it becomes sort of this depressing cycle of like, well, if that's all it takes to get power, you know, what can I do? What does being effective in opposition mean or look like when power is so divorced from any standard, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the phrase that has come to mind, because I think there is also a way, and I've read other people who have been talking about ways to view our current moment in a little bit more of a hopeful light, is the phrase, you can just do things. There
That's
has
true.
been there has been at least one thing that I saw Timothy Faust, healthcare activist who's now living in Wisconsin, my old home state, talked about the way that Tony Evers smuggled a decimal place movement into a bill. Oh, yeah, here it is. So just the other day, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which of course had a very contested election about a month or so ago that Elon Musk kind of infamously weighed in on and lost big on, the
Yep.
Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld Tony Evers' veto of a bill that basically amended it and boosted school funding for 400 years. And again, he did this just by literally going into the bill. He changed the year that it would expire from
4 years to 400.
yeah, it was from 2024 to 2025. And then he just changed, he took out the 20s. So now it's going until 24-25, the year that this funding bill, the $325 per pupil per year funding increase. And again, it's like, that's amazing. Like, that's something that is like, it's similarly, kind of a little petty, kind of a little sneaky, but also just that's like an unabashedly good thing. And it was done with this sort of notion that, yeah, I mean, if you have the power, you should exercise it. You should do good things for people because you can. You actually do have that power. It's a good reminder.
Yeah, I mean, as the conservative movement embodied by this administration increasingly heightens the contradictions in its own rhetoric and its exercise of power, it raises the question of why there's no opposition that's doing the same on the other side. Because, like,
Right.
and this is something we've discussed before too, but as the Overton window, which is obviously a problematic metaphor, but as the center of politics shifts to the right, any Democratic administration that would come in afterwards should be equally and ferociously attempting to shift it in the other direction just to
Yes.
restore some kind of normalcy. If the real goal is restoring normalcy, which is often the kind of liberal democratic rhetoric, the only way to do that is to reorient things to the left as they've shifted more and more to the extreme right.
Yeah.
And tools like that allow that to be done. And I think it's important. One of the things that I think over the last year and a half has been helpful for me, and we've explored it on the show, is to think through theoretical frameworks that give us something to hang on to in these
Mm.
times. Because, like, you know, you can talk about it just straight politically. You can talk about it in terms of organizing. You can hold up examples like the Wisconsin election or the college anti-war movement, which, has
Yes.
really come ferociously back into power in the
Yeah.
last couple of years. You can talk about union organizing. There are these little examples of moments of hope and of challenges to power that you can hang on to. But what I often find even more reassuring is that there's a body of theory and practice that preexists all of this that can help us understand what's going on, that we can turn to understand the news, to understand politics, and to just remain consistently critical of
Yeah.
what we're hearing. And for me, critical discourse studies is a field that provides that. We've been talking a lot about discourse and manipulation over the last year or two, and one of the most fascinating frameworks for me is assumptions analysis, which comes from Norman Fairclough and others in the critical discourse studies school. And I think especially when you're looking at like Trumpist rhetoric, There are so many fascinating assumptions that you find and that tell you a lot about the ideology that animates Trumpism and certainly can inspire effective responses.
I wanted to also say, I mean, one of the other things I like about
Yeah.
Norman Fairclough's book, we're talking about the book Analyzing Discourse, published originally in 2003, really still holds up in terms of the kind of frameworks that Fairclough provides and that he synthesizes from other approaches of CDS scholars. But it also provides, I think, a kind of instructional, I mean, he's got a lot of good historical examples of analyzing political rhetoric that might not be so blatant in its weaponization of assumptions and its use of manipulative strategies, but nonetheless shows the political rhetoric that prefigured the moment that we're in, where those strategies maybe were a little more subtle and it took a little bit more sort of like picking apart and nuance to really understand the kinds of assumptions that were being brought forth, like his examples about the EU and globalization and all of these other things that were happening around the turn of the century, you know, the Iraq War and other wars in the Middle East that were kind of poignant topics at the time, very much prefigure this 21st century moment that we're in. And so as a result, I
100%.
think it's a good keystone text to go back to for just keeping your tools sharp for critical inquiry in the time that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this before, but the fact that CDS scholars were really engaged in critiquing discourses around neoliberalism, immigration politics, and racism involved in immigration politics, and war and propaganda on behalf of the war on terror. Like those three issues are still, I would say, among the most animating and consequential in American politics.
Yeah, prefigurative in their ways too, you know, as we see the reemergence of the word terrorist being used to describe American citizens and legal
Yeah.
residents. It's not an accident that that's in our lexicon and deeply ingrained as an ideograph. And these kinds of tools help us track that.
Absolutely. And so within Fairclaugh's assumptions analysis framework, one of the things that I think is also important to say about it is way back in the early days of this show, we did a reblurb episode on dialogicality.
Yes.
And so this is kind of a concept that comes from Mikhail Bakhtin, which views all discourse as multi-voiced, all discourse as fundamentally made up of other discourses. Every single text is made up of the residues of other texts, right? And we can sort of evaluate any single text or any single utterance on to what extent it is opening up that difference and dialogicality and to what extent it's reducing it or seeking to suppress it. And this actually becomes a really interesting rhetorical ethic, like a way of evaluating rhetoric for its own sake as, I would say, like pretty fundamentally good or bad. Like the extent to which in your rhetoric you acknowledge difference versus seeking to suppress it or hide it or ignore it really tells you something about the ethics of that discourse. And I think it can be easy to slide into nihilism, like, oh, rhetoric is just a tool that can be used for good or bad, or you can't really evaluate rhetoric for its own sake. It all depends on who's using it. And while that is true to some extent, this kind of assumptions analysis can enable us to say, no, this specific way of framing this or phrasing this has moral implications.
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And I mean, you don't even have to stay contemporary for, you know, an analysis of what makes this kind of rhetorical analysis ethical. I mean, this is going back to the sophists like Isocrates, the practice of dissoi logoi, of placing, you know, competing propositions against one another and really trying to sort of like, you know, agonistically battle it out between the sort of competing visions. Cicero had the practice of controversia that was using largely the same framework, right? It's opening up dialogical possibilities in order to come up with the best, most well-rounded, most ethical possible argument in a given situation with given means of persuasion, just by looking at all the different types of ways of viewing the situation that you could.
Right. And you know, there I think some people might have a knee-jerk reaction to this, like, oh, this is just a kind of liberal centrism. Like, you got to hear both sides of any given issue. Like, you know, let's let's put a left argument up and a right argument up and triangulate directly into the center of that, and then we arrive at the truth. And I don't think that's as much how critical discourse studies scholarship views dialogicality. I think they more view it as really a way to critique propaganda, because what
Yes.
propaganda always attempts to do is to define a kind of center of truth that cannot be disputed, right?
Right.
And assumptions do that, right? So Fairclough writes in Analyzing Discourse that intertextuality opens up difference, whereas assumptions reduce difference. So in any given text, the most dialogical option, he writes, would be to explicitly attribute representations to sources, to voices, and to include much of the range of voices that actually exists, unquote. So, simply providing sources for what you say, for the arguments you make, is a more dialogical option than not providing any sources, right? This is why we teach our students to do good research and cite sources. This is why many people are so disturbed by generative AI hallucinating sources, brutally misquoting sources. I talk a lot about this example from my surveillance studies class where we had Copilot generate a sample essay response in response to one of our assignment prompts so that we could critique it as a class. And Copilot took a quote from Simone Brown, who's one of the most well-known recent surveillance studies scholars in Black surveillance studies, and more or less directly asserted the opposite of what Simone Brown was arguing. And so not just appropriating an existing source, but directly misquoting it and getting the idea completely flipped. Examples like that abound, I think, in problematic research writing and problematic public argumentation. So that would be even a slightly more dialogical option would be misquoting a source. At least you're attempting to include a source. But
Right.
Fairclough goes on, quote, a less dialogical option is a modalized assertion.
Mhm.
So modal language is like when you add the word may. So for example, he's talking about a text from European Union economic discourse that says, quote, it may impose deep and rapid adjustments, talking about like financial policy, right? So it may do that in the future. And so including that word may allows this to be taken as a statement of possibility, not a direct assertion of a guaranteed truth. And so as Fairclough writes, it's, quote, dialogically open to other possibilities. And he goes on to say, an even less dialogical option is the categorical, non modalized assertions, which leave no room for other possibilities. So when you make a direct assertion, for example, the earth is flat, right? No modality around that. I'm not saying it could be the case that the earth is flat. It may be true that the earth is flat. If I directly state that, that's a very undialogical option. And then the least dialogical option, which is the focus here, is the assumption. So simply taking a given assertion for granted as truth.
Instead of saying the earth is flat, you often embed an assumption into another proposition to kind of hide that proposition itself. So,
Yeah.
for example, the government is hiding from us the flat earth
Yeah. Or the
conspiracy or something like that.
right. Or the flatness of the earth requires that we not drive too far into the horizon. So if I said that, I would be
Right,
assuming that I have already proven that the earth is flat, but I
right,
haven't, right? And
right.
so that's a very undialogical way to reason. And so obviously this, I think it's probably worth saying before we get into our analysis here that not all assumptions are bad, right? Some of them are actually just necessary to reason about anything. And even some like scientific propositional assumptions are probably good. Like, I think it probably is good that we assume the efficacy of vaccines, or we
Yeah.
assume, in fact, the earth is round.
Or even things like the validity of climate science and
Right.
the other things like that. I mean, in many ways, it's kind of interesting to see the anti-climate science movement as an attempt to widen the dialogical space, but in a bad way. There are moments where you can analyze that, specifically when you get into discourse communities, highly specialized discourse communities, assumptions can often take the form of shorthand, disciplinary jargon, other kinds of things that stand in for wider debates that have already been dialogued on and settled from a
Right.
long time past. But particularly in the context of political arguments, where somebody who is, of the pundit class or in a position of power is making an argument to an audience that might not be as aware or as educated as inside of that discourse as they are, this leaves open the possibility of manipulation. Assumptions can be very manipulative in the way that they're inserted into these discourses.
Yeah, 100%. And really, what we're trying to do with assumptions analysis is not necessarily say that all assumptions are bad, but rather that they tell us a great deal about what is the dialogical space that a given rhetor wants to allow for, what
Right.
is the space that they want to close down. And so I have been really fascinated by this conversation about tariffs. Tell me how you're feeling about it, Alex, because, from my perspective, this is one of the weirdest things politically that's happened in my life. And we've
Yes.
lived through a very weird political time in our lives, but this is just completely baffling. I often can't wrap my head around it, both because I'm not trained in economics and because it just seems so obviously self-destructive.
Yeah, I mean, I also am tempted to say that it feels like a totally inscrutable moment. Why on earth, when even, people who are not experts in economic analysis can clearly see that placing massive tariffs on companies that we more or less, I'm talking, when I say we, I mean US Americans, rely on for cheap goods, more or less at the behest of their cheap labor, which again, I'm not saying is a good thing, but it's a foundational necessity of the stability of the American economy, is now being called into question. And, the only real upshot that you can see from these tariff policies is that when you place an extra tax or a levy on a good that comes in from another country, more often than not, like most other supply and costs, they end up getting placed on the consumer. They get passed on, right? They socialize the costs and privatize the benefits. That's kind of the name of the game. But, even members of my family who are, fiscally conservative are equally baffled by this, do not understand what this policy is designed to accomplish. I mean, as near as I can tell, this may be the first time that, it feels like a cliche to say, oh, we're in a post-truth world with reality denying people in positions of power, but this might be the first time that like a check has really come due on a kind of like
Yeah.
economic realism, and the way that, the kind of consequences of this sort of belligerent rhetoric that the Trump administration is putting forward. All of a sudden they're realizing that actually this might be a bridge too far, that you might not, this might be a third rail that you actually cannot touch and have to be brought to heel on by the forces of global capital, whatever those might be. To me, anyway, that's my current read of it.
Yeah. And we should say that there's some evidence that they're going to be dialing some of this back because they are getting some blowback from it. But just two things I wanted to say about that. The first is that I'm really glad you brought up Trump's capacity to reshape people's sense of objective truth, or as you said, this post-truth era. I think back to the debate over vaccines, which he and his movement more or less single-handedly made much more controversial than it had been prior to COVID.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah, the fact that we're now seeing measles outbreaks and we're seeing much more hesitancy to take the flu vaccine nationally. Like one guy basically did that. And similarly, on immigration, during the Obama presidency, if you look back at historical polling, the support for liberal immigration policy was really, really high. It was not until Trump became this popular national political figure that he persuaded people for, seemingly to support a more draconian immigration policy simply through the power of like these fantastical stories about immigrant hordes at the border. And I think that tariffs feels like the latest example of just one guy's mania kind of hijacking the entire sense of the objective center of truth. But then the second thing I wanted to say is that the politics of this has been very peculiar because the administration is, in a sense, at least rhetorically, positioning itself as a left wing anti capitalist advocate, which is just completely baffling when the head of the administration is kind of the icon of capitalism. He's
Right.
the apprentice, he's Trump Tower. I mean, this is just like gaudy American capitalism at its finest. And his administration is riddled with people from private industry. And yet they called the day when the tariffs were announced Liberation Day. They're very much, they claim to be speaking on behalf of the American worker. And you even have, as we're going to be looking at in a second, you have people claiming to represent the US left who are trying to justify this policy and find ways to connect it to earlier conversations that went on, for example, right here where I am in the Battle of Seattle, these
That's
kinds
right.
of like large scale popular movements against free trade in the 90s and early 2000s on the very strong grounds that free trade hurts labor conditions, creates greater opportunities for corporate exploitation and all of these kinds of things.
Right. Yeah.
So, turning now to our example, tell me what you know about Batya Ungar Sargon. Have you heard of this person?
Yeah, unfortunately, this feels like one of those, one of those names that doesn't quite come up in your feed enough that have like consistently blocked this person across channels. But every time she does come up, it's just, you get kind of an eye roll of sort of like, oh, this person again. Batya Ungar Sargon, to my knowledge, is sort of a career contrarian in that she seemingly, I don't, if I were to be asked to describe principles that she has as a pundit, because that's mainly what she does is goes on TV and talks or writes articles. She's of the class that shovels political snow for a living. Don't really know what her principles are. She occasionally seems to be chasing some kind of populist resentment against whatever elite means to her discourse circle that day, but is often somebody like she wrote for Spiked online notoriously for many years, which is an organization that actually came out of a communist movement in Great Britain and then kind of slowly became this kind of reactionary, right-leaning libertarian rag over time that still laundered most of its ideals through this lens of being for the working class against the elites. But somehow that also entails like free market economics and anti-communism and a strange aversion to central planning and things like that. And more, I mean, really more on just sort of cultural grievance is kind of what they would trade on. So, I mean, that's
Obsessed with trans people, right?
absolutely obsessed, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like if we want to put it very simply, Batya Ungar Sargon kind of one of the primary exemplars of what we might call the horseshoe left. The fact that we even have to talk about that is a bummer because this is often a cudgel used against the left by Clintonian center right liberals that if you go too far left, you just end up on the right. And that's really not true at scale. But then
Mm.
you have people like Batya Ungar Sargon who seem to be doing their damnedest to prove it right, using left terminology and left frameworks to defend the most right wing American president perhaps in history, certainly in modern history. This is an article published by Batya Ungar Sargon called Liberation Day Puts Main Street Ahead of Wall Street, published in Commonplace, which, by the way, this is also a fascinating publication. I was looking into it. So it calls itself the home for the new right, building and sustaining a durable conservative majority. Some of the other figures who publish for this include John Saylor from the Manhattan Institute. And we should say that the Manhattan Institute, this is the home of Christopher Rufo, who kind of popularized the anti-critical race theory panic Helen Andrews writes for this
Mm.
publication. She's a very prominent, I believe, British trans exclusionary radical feminist. So a lot of people with dodgy ties to the far right
Absolutely.
publish. And of course, these far right outlets, they often name themselves very generically. So calling this place Commonplace, also a rhetorical term, interestingly
Definitely. I
enough.
was good. Yeah, not a rhetorical term and also something that kind of pre-frames them as being, common sense, common knowledge,
Yes.
right? It's the place of the commons, the place where we host the views of the common person, however true that may be.
Yeah. So I'm going to read some from this article and just ask us to analyze assumptions as they come up. But I want to really briefly say something about Fairclough's method for analyzing assumptions. So he breaks this down into three types of assumptions. The first are existential assumptions. So those are assumptions about things that exist. The second is propositional assumptions, and that's basically just assuming a claim without making it directly. And then lastly, values assumptions. Those are assumptions about what is good or desirable. So I have several excerpts from this picked out. If as soon as you hear interesting assumptions, feel free to point them out, Alex. So again, this is Liberation Day puts Main Street ahead of Wall Street. And the subhead, Trump's tariffs make his commitment to America's forgotten men and women clear.
I'm going to stop you right there because there's
Okay.
already an
What do you got?
assumption in there. This would be, I mean, this is a clear example of an existential assumption, something that is, as we talked about earlier, embedded into a larger proposition to kind of smuggle the idea in. Trump's commitment to America's forgotten men and women. What? What are we talking about here?
I might even say that there's an existential assumption embedded into a propositional assumption there. So
Mm-hmm.
I would call his commitment to America's forgotten men and women, that's a propositional assumption because existential assumptions are always about objects. Generally, they're about objects or figures.
Things that are in a state of current being.
Exactly. But this clearly assumes that Trump is committed to those figures who have just been assumed to exist as well. So there's so much built into this, which is who do we think Batya means by America's forgotten men and women? I don't want to, like sound too woke about this, but I'm guessing Batya is not talking about trans men or women. And I'm
Absolutely
guessing
not.
Batya is not talking about men or women of color. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I would also imagine probably not, just given what we know about Batya Ungar Sargon and the kinds of things that she has put out in the past. But perhaps the article will provide some further evidence as we read on.
Let's see. So I'll read a little bit from the introduction here. Quote, ever since Donald Trump's first term as president, his detractors in the Democratic Party and their spokespeople in the mainstream liberal media have had a recurring refrain. His single achievement in office was a tax cut for him and his rich buddies. It was always nonsense, erasing the significant tax cuts middle and working class Americans got, as well as his achievements controlling the southern border, imposing tariffs on China to force supply chains elsewhere, and more generally, shrinking the income gap for the first time in 60 years.
Whew. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that are already buried in there. It is interesting that she does also put a prosopoetic dialogical reference in here, which is that the Democratic Party and their spokespeople in the liberal mainstream media, those are all assumptions there as well, existential assumptions about detractors in the Democratic Party. Who are they? We don't know. Who are their spokespeople in the mainstream liberal media? Well, presumably they exist, and presumably they've all been saying his single achievement in office was a tax cut for the rich. So again, I mean, I think there are also ways that these non-dialogical, very closed down kinds of assumptions are, again, smuggled into these more dialogical statements that make it sound like, oh, okay, well, she is acknowledging that there's another side of the debate, but it's still coming from an incredibly vague source. There is no actual citation of the type of person or even a specific person who said this. It's all being done basically to set up an easy to knock down kind of straw man of an argument that she is then going to go into.
Right. And it, of course, ignores the fact that the mainstream media is not actually liberal, is often
No.
quite conservative, is often nickel and diming, liberals on social policy and stuff like that. But
Yes.
we could get into that. But I also want to note too that, there's an assumption here that those tax cuts were significant. I don't have a great memory of those affecting me that much. I don't know about you,
I
Alex.
also don't. I was really unsure. Again, you can't, it's one of those things where you feel kind of insane when you read something like this because it's like, at first you start asking yourself, did I miss something? And then it's like, no, this person is being manipulative. They're naming something that isn't real.
Yeah.
Tax cuts for middle and working class Americans is a phantasm. Um,
Yeah. The assertion that he shrunk the income gap for the first time in 60 years. I mean, that just feels bizarre too, like attributing agency to Trump that has not been proven.
yes.
But I'll go on. Quote, but let Liberation Day, Trump's moniker for April 2nd, the day he imposed across the board reciprocal and global tariffs, put to bed the myth that Trump is beholden to the rich.
That phrasing of the myth that Trump is beholden to the rich is just, I mean, that's an amazing phrase.
Yeah.
I mean,
Again, he is
yes,
the
he
rich.
is the rich. He literally plated the Oval Office in gold. I mean, what more evidence do you need? It goes back to the classic John Mulaney line of like, Donald Trump is a poor man's idea of a rich man.
In fact, to me, at this point, like Donald Trump is not just a rich man. Like Donald Trump is almost like what a hobo imagines a rich man to be. It's like years ago, Trump was walking through an alley and he heard some guy just like, oh boy, as soon as my number comes in, I'm gonna put up tall buildings with my name on them. I'll have fine golden hair and a TV show where I fire people with my children. And Trump was like, that is how I will live my life. Thank you, hobo, for that life plan.
Exactly. And like even all of his obsession with other countries are ripping us off, or, like he wants the wealth of the world to all be controlled by our rich. It's kind of like reverse mirror populism that
Yeah.
positions American rich as fundamentally at odds with global rich, when really it's just one global ruling
Yeah.
class, right?
Exactly. And that's always been kind of the main point of critique that you can come at these kinds of positions with is that when they talk about elites, they're only talking about maybe a couple of specific, or, again, it's usually vague enough where they don't actually cite anything or anybody. But what they are talking about is like, well, there are some good elites, like, all of the richest men in the world, like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk, who were front row at Donald Trump's inauguration. No,
Yep.
he's not. I mean, they don't count for reasons. But when we're talking about, I don't know, people who work in international finance, for some reason, that's a proper elite rich boogeyman to go after and not the ones that we home grow domestically.
Yeah. So going on here, quote, President Trump has outraged the elites of the international global economic order by ending the globalization promoted fleecing of the American working class with mass tariffs.
The globalization promoted fleecing is a hell of a nominalization right there. That is astonishing. I mean, we've talked about nominalizations on this podcast previously. It's often a very good place where you can smuggle in some good assumptions, where you turn actions into nouns or adjectives into nouns. Globalization promoted fleecing of the American working class with is just, again, like what could you possibly be referring to? I mean, it's not to say that like the American working class might not have, had some detriments paid to it from the globalization of, say, industrial production or something like that, the offshoring of those jobs. But I mean, again, we're thinking in these two narrow domestic terms, right?
Yes.
The quote unquote fleecing of the American working class is so that they could go and fleece working class people in Vietnam and China and other places where they don't have labor protections and can pay you starvation wages to make cheap products.
It's completely ignoring the low priced goods that the American working class has benefited from.
There have been huge benefits for the American working class.
And that's not to say that that's good, but it's simply to acknowledge that it's more complicated than, globalization has been a net loser for the American working class. Like it may be the case that what globalization does, and part of why it's so effective an economic strategy for large firms, is that it gets the American working class to buy into the exploitation of the global working class, right?
Yes. Yeah,
And that entire debate just gets completely assumed out in that sentence.
that's right.
I just want to read one other part from that paragraph. Quote, doing so meant dismissing the importance of quarterly earnings reports and dividends of his rich buddies to reorder the global trade system toward ordinary Americans instead.
How
How is it doing that?
How is it doing that? That doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense whatsoever. Again, one of the things that you'll see assumptions doing, and one of the reasons they can be such a manipulative strategy, is that by being stated confidently with low modality, it makes you, the reader, sort of wonder, like, okay, I need to reconstruct in my mind a representation of how what this person is saying could be true. This reordering of the global trade system toward ordinary Americans, I mean, that could take a whole variety of different forms. Like it could be meaning lower prices for American consumers. It could mean bringing back reshoring industrial production and manufacturing and those kinds of jobs. Again, because it's left vague, but it's still stated in such propositionally certain terms, it is, I think, definitionally a manipulative strategy that's trying to get you to assume its truth value without any interrogation.
Right. So Batya goes on to give us a little bit of history here. Quote, the old elite status quo was maintained by both parties for decades before Trump's election. In the 1970s, the largest share of U.S. GDP was held by the middle class, not coincidentally because 25% of our economy was in manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs give people access to a middle class standard of living and the American dream.
It
Yet it,
also, might lose you a
unquote.
few fingers, and, workplace safety was a whole thing. There's a, whole book about the fact that industrial manufacturing meant that like rat parts were being put into our food and that labor exploitation ran rampant in these places too. But that's not part of the American dream as it gets construed in an existential assumption like this one.
Well, and this claim that the middle class had the largest share of US GDP, not coincidentally because 25% of our economy was in manufacturing, that kind of fetishizes the sector of the economy more than the actual nature of the jobs, right?
Yes.
The protections,
Yeah.
the fact that the workforce was significantly more unionized at that time, the fact that
Absolutely.
tax rates were way higher on the 1%
Yeah.
at that time. None of that is mentioned, right? The only
Yeah.
reason that's given here is manufacturing. People were in factories. Factories are good.
Yeah, this is again another construction that you see with these kinds of propositional assumptions is, it kind of presumes a correlation equals causality, a kind of logic to it,
Yes.
that US GDP was held by the middle class because coincidingly 25% of the economy was in manufacturing, so therefore it was because of that. And again, like you're saying, there is a lot of other contingencies and externalities that need to be used to contextualize that claim such that it's not just a simple A because B.
Yeah, and also totally ignores the fact that we had a massive wartime Keynesian economy at that
Yeah,
time as
heaven
well.
forbid that, we talk about the 1970s without acknowledging that the
Yeah.
after wave of that post-war boom. Absolutely.
Batya goes on. Yet in the intervening years, we went from an economy built on good jobs for ordinary Americans supporting a thriving middle class to an economy largely driven by finance and real estate, which accounts for a whopping 20% of GDP. Unsurprisingly, over 60% of our national wealth is now in the hands of the top 10%. For decades, our economy has fostered an upward transfer of wealth from the working class to the asset rich. What Trump is trying to do with his tariffs is simple: reverse that trend, unquote.
Yeah. So, this is where I would say that, Batya is making some assumptions, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. For example, the fact that 60% of our national wealth, again, what does that mean? That itself is our national wealth is something that doesn't really exist. That's an existential assumption, is now in the hands of the top 10%. And again, a lot of that, when we talk about an economy largely driven by finance and real estate, there's a lot to unpack there. But yeah, that is, I think still a largely correct assumption, right? The fact that financialization has made our economy more sort of dependent on the prospect of future value rather than immediate in the moment value. And as a result, it is a lot more volatile. It's prone to, these sort of like bubble burst cycles, boom bust cycles when promises are made and then don't fully come due. We saw that in not only the 70s and 80s, but also in, of course, the 2008 recession with the collapse of the real estate market because of the over financialization of subprime mortgages. And so, I mean, again, she's not totally wrong here in some of the assumptions that she's making. It's just that she's drawing like ludicrously incorrect conclusions about tariffs being the thing that solves that. Like that doesn't definancialize the American economy. You can't do that with like one overnight like again, I feel like it shouldn't be this easy to debunk this, but this is so stupid.
Yeah. And again, I mean, for me, this is probably the most controversial assumption that runs throughout this whole article is the line, what Trump is trying to do with his tariffs.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anyone knows what Trump is trying to do with his tariffs. I'm not sure even Trump knows what he's trying to do with his tariffs. And that's where, propaganda reaches this point of like monomaniacal, like lack of dialogicality, where it reaches it's just kind of one guy. Like it is one person shooting from the hip. And like you can't even attribute it to a ruling class anymore. It's a mad king. I'll just skip ahead to a little bit of interesting foreign policy assumption work.
Yes.
So Batya goes on to say, quote, the goal of the tariffs is not only about manufacturing and ending unfair trade practices. Trump has long said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, and he has used it as a tool to accomplish a wide variety of goals. One major existing concern is national security, where the production of critical components of our armed forces, the technology of the modern world, and beyond has moved abroad, often to China. A sovereign nation simply cannot rely on its greatest enemy for pharmaceuticals, steel, aluminum, lumber, semiconductors, and the very ships that it will need to fight should the situation call for it. And yet, China controls vital choke points in those industries.
I mean, there are so many of all three types of assumptions in here, existential, propositional, and value judgments about, a concern, right? Is national security. Whose concern is national security? What do we mean by national security? The production of critical components for armed forces, the technology of the modern world. Again, all of that assumption ridden has been moving to China. But
its
again,
greatest enemy.
Yeah, its greatest enemy. Yeah, exactly.
Calling China our greatest enemy.
Yeah, this would be, for me, a hallmark of if Batya here was a student in my freshman composition class, this would be a great moment to talk about the need for contextualization and sourcing, because this is just a ludicrously simplified vision of the world that feels like it's coming from somebody who does not understand the way that global economics and geopolitics works. Like, you cannot just overnight, again, say, okay, well, we're not going to source any of our pharmaceuticals, steel, aluminum, lumber, semiconductors from the country that produces the most of those things. Like,
right.
there is no place to reshore. The factories are dilapidated. They don't exist anymore. Like you're hearkening back to just an assumption that an alternative to this does currently exist, that an overnight tariff policy could and again, I'm not trying to defend global finance here by any stretch. It's just that if you actually don't want working people to suffer as you claim, you would really oppose a policy like this, because this is the kind of policy that's going to wreak hell on people's lives in the way that it affects, because the global economy, such as it's set up, we're kind of trapped in it. It affects us all. It is going to affect our daily well-being, whether or not we can, ensure this flow of cheap goods.
And it also assumes that the best policy long term for the working class is to maintain a war posture towards
Oh,
China. Another
yeah,
way that
great
you could
point.
reason based on all of these same assumptions is that it's a great opportunity to actually make peace with China, to form an actual alliance with China because
Yeah.
they produce all of these things that we need. If we could come to an actual bilateral trade and national security relationship that was built on equity and peace, then how much stronger might we be and how much better might the products and materials that we
Yeah.
derive collectively from that relationship be?
Oh, it's a real unfortunate time to not be living in Europe or China right now, which are showing signs of wanting to come to more trade agreements that are mutually beneficial in response to the belligerence of the United States. I mean, this is what you might call the sort of Dr. Manhattan trade policy. You're giving everybody else something to unite against. And as a result, you are creating global peace, just not for you or your country or your citizenry.
Right. So going on, I do want to read this part where Batya brings in the issue of border policy.
Mm.
Quote, Trump has already used tariffs to achieve significant foreign policy concessions. His threats to Mexico resulted in the country finally policing its side of our southern border for the first time since Trump left office in 2021. The number of illegal migrants crossing our border has dropped to almost zero. These are significant wins for working class Americans whose wages were impacted by the massive free flow of illegal labor crossing the border throughout the Biden presidency. Trump is also hoping that the tariffs will be a source of revenue to combat our ballooning debt.
Yeah, again, it's like, does this person, does she have a direct ear to the president? Like, how does she? This just feels like a lot of assumptions about, what Trump is actually hoping that the tariffs are going to accomplish. But also, yeah, the fact that it's like, oh, great, these tariffs are causing another country to militarize its border too. Great. That actually does not sound good to me. That doesn't sound like a useful thing. It sounds like it's probably making these places more dangerous. And I also don't accept the assumption about, wages of working class Americans being impacted by a massive free flow of quote unquote illegal labor. Like, these were not jobs that any naturalized citizen was probably working anyway. And again, as much as I want to say that, like, I really, really, really do not support the degraded labor conditions of undocumented workers, that also is something that keeps prices low for things like food. Because who do you
Mm-hmm.
think is picking in the fields in Southern California where most of America's food is grown? It's people who are sometimes even just seasonal workers coming up from Mexico. It's not even sometimes people who are staying for the long haul.
Right.
Again, just so much left unsaid and uncontextualized here that it really is hardly worth anything.
Right. And I do want to flag just the massive free flow of illegal labor crossing the border. I mean, so that is an existential assumption with a propositional assumption embedded into it. But
Mm-hmm.
even just looking at the phrase, the massive free flow of illegal labor, that it really illustrates why looking at existential assumptions can be such a powerful critical tool, because that is asserting the existence of something that's fundamentally a metaphor. And it's a very dehumanizing metaphor. The idea that undocumented workers crossing the border are a kind of flow, like an
Yeah.
inhuman,
Like a
uh,
flood,
yeah,
like a
force,
natural disaster.
equivalent
Yeah.
to a natural disaster. And so that's really problematic. I'll
Yes.
just read the final paragraph here because I think it kind of captures so much about the propaganda that's going on here. Batya writes, quote, the message of the tariffs is simple. We are refusing the race to the bottom on wages. Continuing to do so would harm the American worker. Tariffs instead represent a redistribution of wealth from the elites who are invested in finance and real estate to ordinary Americans. We have to start betting on the American worker rather than against him or her and rebuild the pathway to the American dream for every American. Tariffs can help make that possible.
Again, how do you go from tariffs to wages here? Like, I mean, there's so much in between those two things that, the invisible hand is doing some things that we have never seen a human hand do in order to make this,
The invisible hand is getting a little handsy here.
It's getting a little,
We're going back to
touchy
shock
feely
docs.
here. Yeah. Oh no. Oh no. I mean, yeah, not to again bring it back to like a simple pop culture reference, but it's the gnome flowchart in South Park, the steal underwear, middle part question mark, third part profit.
So what are you gonna do with all these underpants that you steal? Collecting underpants is just phase 1. Phase 1, collect underpants. So what's phase 2? Hey, what's phase 2? Phase 1, we collect underpants. Yeah, but what about phase 2? Well, phase 3 is profit. Get it? I don't get it. You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit. Oh, I get it.
Exactly.
No, what happens in that middle part there? If we can't see the process through which that's designed to happen, again, whether that's reshoring jobs, making industry more, again, I'm having to do all the work of freaking explaining all of the ways in which you could possibly make sense of this, because so much of it is unarticulated and left as existential and propositional assumptions, as well as values, right? About whether or not race to the bottom on wages. Like what is that even?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the big takeaway here is that as these policies get increasingly monomaniacal and like Mad King coded, we're going to see more and more of these assumptions, and you want to be on the lookout for them, right? Because increasingly it's not even like a class that's ruling. It's just like one guy and his weird friends. So not to be depressing here, but that's the world we live in, and we have to stay critical about the discourse they're putting out.
And I think a lot of it comes down to just not using the framing that they give us for some of these issues, right? Like so much of their framing of these issues, whether it's Batya or Trump or any of their lackeys, they're going to be presenting you with these visions of reality that don't feel like they're open to contest. And they are. They really, really are. Whether you're a journalist or somebody who's just on social media or just a critical consumer of media, you don't have to believe this. You do not have to accept that premise. You can always question the question that they're putting forth in front of you. All that I'm saying is that you do have the freedom to refuse these kinds of assumptions and these kinds of framings. And knowing how to distinguish assumptions from an actually sourced statement or something that is propositionally dialogical is, I think, helpful in trying to understand where and when we're being manipulated here.
Yeah, you too can become Mikhail Shocktin and increase the dialogicality in your world instead of reducing it.
Yeah, don't be a Kenneth Jerke. Be a Mikhail Shocktin. Is what we're trying to say. Don't be.
That's all we're saying here.
That's all we're saying, folks.
Something that clearly makes a lot of sense and
absolutely, absolutely.
Anyway, folks, we're so glad you tuned in for this episode. We'll be back with more Reverb content soon, but until then, stay critical, stay dialogical. Any other last words, Alex?
We'll see you next time. Looking forward to the next 100.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, and tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.